Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast. And I'm joined by my co-host, John Lee. And this is a unique and different episode for us. So tell our good listeners, John, what they can expect.
For the very first time, Irish Stew will be done before a live and actually paying audience, part of the First Irish Festival put on annually by the Origin Theatre Company. And let's kick it off with the artistic director of the Origin Theatre Company, the man who invited us to be the first podcast on the First Irish Festival, Mick Mellamphy.
Thank you so much, John. Nice to see you and talk to you guys again. Martin, how are you?
All good here, Mick, and great to have you on the podcast again. We're delighted to be included. Can you give our listeners your thinking behind including Irish Stew in this year's festival?
Recently, I had a great conversation with our great partners at the Northern Ireland Bureau. The new director, Richard Cushney, and I had a great conversation, and we decided that it would be a great idea to have a podcast in a really, really cool setting like a pub on the Upper East Side, Ryan's Daughter, where we would have that discussion about culture and theatre specifically and how it can shape perception of Northern Ireland, both here in the US and around the globe, and how important it is with cross-border relations on the island of Ireland and throughout the United Kingdom as well. So it's just something that's important for us to make sure that we draw a line under. This is a festival that serves the entire island of Ireland and Irish-inspired artists from around the world.
Great to catch up, Mick. We thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. It's been a great festival. More to come in the future, I'm sure. And let's run over to Ryan's Daughter and kick this thing off. We want to welcome everyone here to our first live podcast event, also the first podcast for the Origin Theatre Festival. And we are going to bring on our two guests here, Labhaoise Magee and Crissy O'Donovan, and some polite applause would be appropriate. I'll tee up Labhaoise here. Grew up in Derry, went to Sarah Lawrence College, just a few miles north of here. Got into theater, was as an actor, director, producer, co-partner in Fair Play Productions, a cross-Atlantic theatrical company, staging productions on both sides of the pond, and striving to develop democratic culture through theater. I think that's a topic we will revisit. And right now you've got Sinéad O'Brien's No One Is Coming, which was one of the opening events in the festival, which I got to see a one-person show. Welcome, Labhaoise.
Thank you. Thanks.
And it is my great pleasure to introduce Crissy O'Donovan to this show, a fellow Dubliner, which is surprising because this evening is an evening dedicated to the impact of theatre in Northern Ireland. Crissy grew up underneath the shadow of the Pigeon House in Dublin, in Irish Town. But she has travelled, and her theatrical endeavours have taken her to Oxford, to London, and strangely to Portstewart in Northern Ireland. Crissy is the producer and company manager of the Big Telly Theatre Company, and we are delighted to have her joining us straight off the plane all the way from Northern Ireland. So please join me in giving her a big hand. So we're going to start off here. Let's just ask the most fundamental question that you should ask any theatre person. Tell me about your first theatre experience, Crissy.
Oh, gosh. My first theatre experience as an audience was seeing John Barrowman in the Olympia Theatre in Dublin doing Love Changes Everything, which is a musical. And it's not really a very commercial, popular musical, but I was in the fifth row with my mum and dad, and I was probably around 11 maybe. And it was a musical and I can't sing, so I was never going to go into musicals. But it was definitely the thing that set me on the road for arts and theatre. It was a game changer. That's probably my first theatrical experience.
And can you tell anybody about the Olympia Theatre experience in Dublin?
Well, the Olympia Theatre is one of the oldest theatres in Dublin. It's just right in the centre, and it's still got all of it. I mean, it's a brilliant music venue. The acoustics are amazing for such an old kind of, I don't know what year it is, maybe like late 1800s. But it's really small. So it's got all the kind of lavish grandness of a beautiful theatre, but it's also really small. So even if you're right in the gods, as they say, it's still, you can hear everything brilliantly and see everything brilliantly. So it's a great, very historical building. Well worth seeing a gig there.
I think the same question for you, Leisha.
My earliest memory seeing theatre is being surprised with tickets to see The Lion King on the West End by my parents, which was really exciting because my sister didn't get to go.
Double win.
Very much a double win. I must have been no more than 6 years old, and she was too young, being 3 years younger than me. And I just remember the animals thinking that they were real, and realizing afterwards that it was all just kind of magic, and it was people that made it happen, and that the music and the colors, and it was just like really a sensory overload in all the best ways. That's my earliest memory. Yeah.
Well, let's take you back to, kind of how you got from here to there. You grew up in Derry, and you found yourself in Bronxville at Sarah Lawrence. Well, give us a sense of, people know Derry for various reasons. Derry, the Derry girls being a nice association with the city. What was it like for you growing up when you grew up there? And then what was the contrast like when you came over to college in the U.S.?
Derry is probably one of my favorite places in the whole world. I'm very biased. Just absolute salt of the earth people. And it was, I realized now 11 years, having lived in the US 11 years, how much I took it for granted, how much I took for granted living in a small place with people who always looked out for each other and had just like the most wicked sense of humor. As you can see in like the TV show Derry Girls, completely accurate. Derry Girls is based on my secondary school. And so I get the privilege of saying that it's very, very, very accurate to my experience, to my mother's experience who went to the same school, and to my grandmother's experience who also went to that school. And so when I first moved here, Derry Girls wasn't a thing. And so I did a lot of explaining of like what it was like to be from the very, very tip of the island, and the type of sense of humor that you have to kind of have grown up in a post-conflict society. And yeah, it's just somewhere that I love. I'm so, so proud to be from. And so, but you don't necessarily think that when you're 18 and you're desperate to get out.
A lot of times you have to get away.
Yeah. Hindsight. And so at 18, I was just like dying to be anywhere outside of my family homes. I could stretch my legs, figure out who I was, and then move into Bronxville, New York was a good compromise because my mum and dad were not keen on the idea of being in New York City. Right. And I was like, well, there's this place that's just outside.
It's a charming place.
It is really. And I guess the reason why I don't know why I ended up specifically at Sarah Lawrence, but when I was growing up, my mother hosted American students studying peace and conflict studies in our house. And most of them were from Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. Right. And so I just wanted to be them. I wanted to like go back with them to America and be in college immediately. And so through them, I kind of figured out what the liberal arts college scene was like in the United States. And luckily, through my grandmother, have American citizenship, which allowed me to study here and live here.
Great.
Yeah.
So back to you, Crissy. We talked about your Olympia theater experience as your first exposure to theater. But when does that conversation happen when you depress your parents and tell them you're going to go into theater? When does the penny drop that this is something that I must do? rather than make lots of money?
Well, I've always been somebody who follows my own path, despite my parents not wanting me to. But I think I went to a guidance counsellor in my secondary school in Dublin, and I said, I want to do theatre. I really want to do theatre as my job. And I think I want to be an actor, because I think everyone who starts out in theatre thinks most people want to be an actor. And you're not really told there are other jobs. You're not told there are stage managers and lighting designers and amazing technicians and producers, you know. Often you're just very blinkered. And so I went to my guidance counsellor and I sat down and I said, look, I want to be in theatre. And she said, well, you're going to go to UCD and you're going to do arts and you're going to join Dramstock. And I went, oh, but that's not, why am I doing an extra degree? I was so confused by it. I was like, can I not just go and do that? And so she wasn't too happy with me, but I did. I went and I moved to Wales and I did a university degree in drama and theatre. And then I left and was a jobbing actor for a little bit, did the fringe scene, and then went back and did my MA in the Oxford School of Drama. Also as an actor, because I felt a degree didn't really give me that practical application. And then from there, I'd always known I wanted to work in theatre, and I just knew that I wanted to just make theatre better, or make, I just wanted to kind of help theatre in some way, and I just kind of accidentally ended up as a producer. So I wasn't really supposed to do that. I just kind of went on maternity leave one day and then came back as a producer. But yeah, my parents did end up supporting me, but they were terrible at validating the work. I always wanted to say, Dad, how was the show you saw me in? You know, if you came to see my show. And he'd say, I had a lovely night from start to finish with your mother. And I was like, we had a great dinner, we had a few drinks, you know, we had a really good night, then we saw your show, and I was like, well, what about me? You know, validate me, I've made this really unique path. And he says, I'm not going to dissect the evening. It was a lovely evening from start to finish. And, you know, but they did love the arts. And my mum was a very creative person. She wasn't, she didn't go into secondary education, but she was a creative writer and stuff like that. So I think she kind of loved that I had that. So.
Tell us a bit about Big Telly, how you got there, what they do.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about the theatre company. Let's talk a little bit about play.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Big Telly Theatre Company have been going for about 35 plus years. They're the oldest running theatre company in Northern Ireland. They started in Portstewart and they're still based there, with another base in Belfast. And really their main focus has been over the years site responsive work. They work in black box spaces and they work in lots of different spaces. But fundamentally, one of the things we call ourselves are people who hijack the familiar. And why we do that is we create spaces and we kind of adopt spaces that are already known for audiences like parks, libraries, houses. We're doing a lot of houses work at the moment. But, domestic spaces that people feel safe in, and then we give them the opportunity to kind of discuss challenging questions in those spaces. And we don't do it in a way that's necessarily politically heightened. We do it in a creative way. We're very much about joy, very much about entertainment, very much about, are the audience here having a good time? Are the audience here safe? And, I was talking to my colleague Gavin there, and he reminded me that we talk a lot about Big Telly shows are like being at a party. They're immersive, but you don't have to. You can leave your coat on and sit by the door at a party, or you can be dancing on the table, and you should still have as good a time. You don't have to be fully kind of, the big personality in the room to kind of get something from the show. So our work is really kind of focused on that. And it's very audience-led, and a lot of the work is devised by artists and the artistic director in the company. So it's really about sometimes the space comes first, sometimes the play comes first. But it's often in unusual spaces, occupying unusual spaces.
Crissy, you're kind of pointing to the theme of the the underlying theme of the evening, which is how theater is telling new stories and creating new narratives of Northern Ireland.
Sure.
And really for both of you, and you mentioned post-conflict, you went there. That's the word that everybody associates, unfortunately, with Northern Ireland. And we hope that association continues to fade. But how does either of your work, we can start with you, Alicia, how does your work or theater in general help people process memory, and especially the kinds of memories that are shared maybe from different perspectives in Northern Ireland? How can theater help there?
Wow. I think that theatre and art is a fundamental practice in any healthy democracy. And I think that the proof is in the pudding when it comes to Ireland and the north of Ireland, and all of the ways that we've been able to tell the truth of our own experiences, some autobiographical, some fictionalized, some a mixture of both, in order to get to the truth of the experiences that we all live, right? And that are actually universal pains that are felt all around the world, that continue to be felt. And theatre is in my opinion, my biased opinion, a necessary tool to be able to help us continue to speak to where we've been and where we're going. And to me, it's been helpful to understand my own identity, especially coming into a new country where I am establishing myself as an American. I have an American citizenship and I have an Irish citizenship, and theatre has been a healthy place for me to sort of tread the boards as an actor, as a director, and figure out who it is that I am and who are the people in front of me, and why is it important that we get to know each other's point of view, and memory, particularly in history, is very important to write down. It's very important to talk to people who've been there. And
they kind of revisit it at times too.
Yeah.
Like this is what we were thinking 10 years ago. How are we thinking about this now?
Yeah, absolutely. I can only speak for myself, right? You know, and I very much subscribe to the idea that we are all unreliable narrators to our own story. That's I really do lead with that as a director. I love anything when you watch a play and you realize the person you were like kind of rooting for the whole time kind of screws you over and contradicts themselves, and suddenly you want to watch. I love anything that I immediately have to go back and watch the play or read the play again to see where it was that they tricked me, or they kind of even tricked themselves in their own memory of an event and things. And yeah, like that to me is exciting. The legacy of being from this particular part of the world is a huge responsibility, I think, for young people and for all people, really. You know, I think we hold a huge global responsibility to be able to talk about why we are, I think, some of the best examples of peacemakers in the entire world. And that's something that Fair Play Productions really strives to be a part of, is promoting not just the fact that we're a post-conflict society, but that we're a pro-peace society, and that we've been very successful at maintaining that. And that's due to the work of local people and governments, both nationally and internationally, to be able to help protect that process.
And Crissy, you come into a little different perspective. You're from Dublin. You did a lot of work in the UK over your career. You relatively recently moved to Northern Ireland. What's your view into this? How do you see it that maybe is different the way Leisha would have experienced it? What does your slightly outsider perspective add to it?
Yeah, I mean, you might even agree with this, but, you know, growing up in Dublin, you were actually quite naive to anything that was, you know, happening. And I think there was an awful lot of I came in very enthusiastic and excited about just meeting Northern Ireland where it was at. And I really got that welcome. I really got a welcome of like a progressive, warm, open place. And I'm kind of coming in from a really wonderfully kind of, I suppose, naive place, because I only see the Northern Ireland I know. And it's incredibly progressive, and the conversations that people are having there and how people want to be defined has evolved dramatically. And, you know, even though how the work is being made and the conversations people want to have, like, you know, you said the word responsibility. I think that's a really important word when we make theatre, when we make any kind of art. We have responsibility, you know, to the audiences, to the artists, to the people in the space, to the writers, to whoever, whatever conversation we're having. And I think what Big Telly tried to do is we create kind of democratic spaces where it's not defined by tribal politics. So I've never really kind of, and it is all about kind of cohesion and community and connectivity, and not so focused necessarily on any kind of political kind of motivation or strand in terms of how we deliver our message. It's all about finding spaces to connect. And I think our responsibility as the world gets, you know, on a global level, the world is slightly more fragile than I think any of us expected, right? And as that kind of happens, theatre has a responsibility to like create joy and to create community and to build connectivity, because I think it is the tool that will allow us to do that. It is a powerful tool in that. And I personally believe, and I think Big Telly kind of really lead with that, is that joy is like really important right now. I mean, you know, and while we make work that is kind of inherently from Northern Ireland by Northern Irish artists, we connect with, like, we're working with 3 Philadelphia artists and a Philadelphia theatre company here, and the tour of Granny Jackson has connected with, every time we go, we tour to like multiple different locations, and the show changes depending on the location. And with that, we have 3 core team members who play the family of Granny, and then we have 3 local artists. And with that comes new conversation, diversifying views, how the story changes and shifts, the dynamics between characters. So our work is really evolving because the conversations we're having as artists is kind of defining the work. And that's just for me as somebody who's come to Northern Ireland, you know, in 2021, you know, I've only ever seen it in that way. So that's kind of my view.
Let me switch here a little bit. I'll go back to Leisha and ask, the show you were doing up in Bellbutt, it's a one-person show. You're the director, if I'm correct, right?
Yes, not the original director, but the one who brought it to the US. Yeah.
So talk to me about the directing experience on a one-person play, if you will. There's one person sitting in front of the audience. And what does that look like? Because I'm not a theatre person, so I can imagine it's much more complex with a lot of people, but how does it differ?
I would have thought that being a podcast that you would, like, I mean, that there might be a bit of similar experience, actually, like speaking out into the ether a bit. And, well, I guess the things as a director that I've learned that need to be addressed like yesterday when you start a one-person show are like, why is the person speaking in the first place, you know? Like, sometimes if you really love the material, you can sort of be like really engrossed in it and then realize you have to figure out as the director why on earth this person began to speak and is speaking on their own to a room full of people. And that sort of process with the performer can be really fun as you unpack a play. And Sinéad O'Brien wrote No One Is Coming, as well as starred in it. It's an autobiographical piece about her experience growing up with 2 parents who were dealing with serious mental health issues that went undiagnosed for a long period of time. And so working with somebody like that who's dealing with their own story, with people whose names have been changed, whose privacy you may want to protect in certain parts, and you're more comfortable or free to reveal in others, you kind of have to establish a lot of trust. You always have to establish trust, but particularly so the performer needs to know that they are safe to do so on stage. And so one thing that, you know, Sinead and I figured out early was like, what is the reason why she's standing on stage today in 2025 talking about something that happened to her over 24 years ago? And what is the relevance of it to the audience, whether she's performing it in Amsterdam, at the Edinburgh Fringe, in Prague, and now in the United States, up in the Bronx. And that is, you know, it's like sensitive stuff, and you have to tread lightly. And I think that it's a really fun and complicated thing when it comes to autobiographical pieces, but we had a lot of fun.
It was interesting that you raised mental health as part of this play, and I don't think you can really talk about Northern Ireland. Everybody might want to talk about the Troubles, but there is the impact which plays out over multiple generations in Ireland of this conflict. And even some people will posit the great Irish national tragedy of the Great Famine. We are still working through the issues of that. And for any Americans in here that don't know a lot about Irish history, there's about 800 years of misery that we're still processing.
Good synopsis.
I just, I'm going to switch now, and I'm going to put
I'm talking to the
Crissy. I'm not going to ask you to talk about the famine, but I'm going to talk to you because I imagine, running theatre in Northern Ireland, you have to be sensitive to the shared traumas that people have had. And how does theatre help begin to build a bridge? How does theatre begin to help heal?
That's a great question, and it is a really, it's a question we ask actually all the time in the work we do. We have a huge amount of variety in the kind of partnership working we do in the arts, and some of it's very cross-sectoral. So we've done work recently with the Commission for Victims and Survivors, which was an installation in a house, and it was with live actors, and we worked closely with the Commission. We used testimonials from victims and their families, and it was the Commission's way of they wanted to find a space for these testimonials to be shared that were in a neutral shared space, but that allowed people to just kind of engage with the conversation rather than feel like it was just being put on them. Because I think transgenerationally, a lot of the young people were saying their conversations are quite cyclical at home, and they were having the same conversations with the same people in the same way. So from my experience, that was one of the first projects I did outside the pandemic with Big Telly, was work with the Commission, and we built this installation in a house in East Belfast and one house in West Belfast. And which again, obviously very different in terms of their relationship and their responses and reactions and their lived experience through the Troubles. And then outside of that, we had them both in different festivals in East and West Belfast, and we worked with a housing executive. And then people came in and they walked around the space and they engaged with the artists, and that was all lovely. And it was really, really well done. It was really emotional, and it was honestly the care that the Commission took in terms of their kind of aftercare for the people who experienced it was it was just wonderful to be part of that and using theatre as part of that, And then afterwards they came to us and they said, we should do it in schools. And we were saying that's not going to work in schools. We need to kind of have a conversation with young people in a way that they're able to kind of, relate to that. If you go into a theatre, into school and do a theatre show for 15 or 16-year-old boys, you might not get an immediate response, So then we worked with Gavin Peden, who's a VR filmmaker, and again with the Commission, and we designed an immersive VR experience with them. And we toured that to schools, and it was still to this day probably as a producer, my favourite audience to watch, because they were allowed to experience that world without any of their peers looking at them. Everybody was just in VR headsets watching this kind of, and it was very much similar to the installation. It was filmed in the same house with the same artists, so there was nothing kind of different necessarily, but the form in which we had a conversation with those people was different. And I think that's another thing theatre can do really well, is it can say, well, I'm having a conversation with you, but I'm not going to necessarily have the same conversation in the same way with you, because our lived experiences are different and how we've engaged with those issues or those traumas are different. And I think, so that's one way, our partnership working is, that's just one example, but we do a huge amount of work with different, Women's Aid or Inspire and homelessness. We work a lot with partnerships, and it's a funding pathway for us to make work as well, partnering with different kind of cross-sectoral institutions, but it's also an opportunity for us to actually genuinely apply the tool of theatre in a way that is for the good of an issue.
We're going to have one more question from me, and then we're going to see if anybody in the audience would like to jump in. And this is, we're in the capital of big theater here in New York. George Clooney's performing tonight for the top ticket price of about $875.
Oh my gosh.
Othello, I think, is at $890, something in that range. I'm hearing a very different vibe here. You're talking about democracy, working through democracy in theater. You're talking about bringing professional theater to communities, engaging people where they are. What's the motivation? It's be nice that everything you did brought in more income, but something else seems to be motivating you. Can you each of you speak briefly to what gets you fired up to do what you're doing?
It gets me fired up that Broadway tickets cost that much. For sure. Yeah, it does. I was just chatting with Gavin as well about like the demographics of the people that you sit down next to in the orchestra on Broadway, right. And how that maybe would inform your experience. Like if you're a teenage boy, a young person trying to go to see a production of Othello, and you're surrounded by people who are that you can't relate to for multiple different reasons. So do better, Broadway. No, I guess, I mean, I moved to America with the same aspirations as many people do, which is to make money. I'm not going to lie about that. Doing theater with that, maybe not the smartest, train of thought. However, I do think that in a country like this, where there is so much wealth, so much resources that we can be using for anything, really, right? That a huge motivation of mine is to convince people that fund George Clooney to appear on Broadway, in an important play, to use that money to also produce more marginalized voices, to have those audiences be representative of the people and the stories that you're hearing about on stage, in a more fair balance.
Fair
and so
play.
In a fair play, thank you. It's a double entendre. Like, I'm glad you said that, because, our goal as a company is to provide equity to artists on stage and people that work off stage as well. So a huge drive for me was because as an actor, the opportunities that I was getting didn't make me feel any more in control or kind of have that I didn't have any ownership of the material and the sort of the positive impact that my being in the role was like, and my being like being minded like a producer in how I would engage with people who would come to see the shows, or talking to press, or promotion and things like that. And so I guess I really am driven by the idea that all of us are hyphenates when we're in any way creative. We all have the capacity to be an actor. We all have the capacity to be a writer, and all of that is baked into who we are as individuals. I reject the idea that someone doesn't think that they are an artist in some way in their human experience. And so, that is what drives me, is the kind of making sure that we are putting our resources in the right places and in a more equitable distribution in this industry.
Crissy, do you have any reaction to that
No,
train of thought?
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think it comes down again to like, I don't want to keep going on about how the world's broken. I say that a lot. My friends are like, we know the world is broken, but it is, and the more things are, I'm affected quite a lot by it personally. I get very overwhelmed by the world at the moment, and I really believe I have a responsibility to actually create joy. I really believe that. I actually think I have that there's so little I feel in control of, and I feel so kind of almost blindsided by it. I think in the last couple of years, I'm like, oh my God, suddenly I'm in control of nothing in my life, and everything feels like it's kind of crazy right now. But what I can do is I can sit with this audience for an hour, and they come up to me afterwards and we have a chat, and they say, that was the best hour I've spent, and I really needed that hour. Or, when we sang those songs together in that living room, no spoilers, but it's great. But it's a really lovely time to be together with people. And I think that's kind of I don't know if I'm going off the point on what you're asking, but I feel like that's what drives me right now, is to like connect and to like build spaces where people can connect and be in a community together, because community is getting harder. Yeah. As the world gets smaller, community is actually getting harder. And I think theatre really has that. And I agree with what a lot of Alicia's saying.
We're going to give these folks a break in just a moment, but we're going to subject them to at least one crowdsourced question here. Does anybody like to jump in? John, down at the end. John Healy, fellow podcaster.
Congratulations and well done to both of you. I have a question for both of you, actually. Kind of profound. Where do you see yourselves 5 years from now?
All right, the question was, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Good short question, John. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't have a yes/no answer to that, John. Gosh, yeah, that is one, you know, and I think probably one I could have answered quite easily 5 years ago, and I can't answer as easily now. I think just not to go on about that same conversation I've had, but it does feel harder to know that. And I hope I'm still being creative. I think Leisha's right in the point that there's art in everybody and there's creativity in everybody. And, you know, and going back to one of the first sentences you said, which is the people make it happen. You know, so I hope whatever I'm doing in 5 years, I'm making things happen with people.
Awesome.
Lisa?
Yeah, no, I totally, I mean, I have such fog, like so many of us right now, about the direction anyone is going in. But I do know I will always find a way to like sit around a table or sit in a room with people who are well-intended and full of stories and full of life that I want to get to know about. And I hope they want to get to know me a bit better too. That's
good close.
A bit like this. Yeah.
And so with those inspiring words, we will conclude the first segment of the podcast by simply saying it is important to meet in the round. I'm delighted to have so many people with us here today, and do your best to support theatre. Get out of the house, experience being in with an audience. That is what makes life worth living. Rubbing shoulders with each other. So we'll take a break now and just give these two wonderful ladies a big round.
So that wraps up part one of Irish Stew Live at the First Irish Festival. And thanks to the support of Origin Theatre Company, Mick Mellamphy, Artistic Director, the Northern Ireland Bureau, and all the good folks at our venue upstairs at Ryan's Daughter. And thanks, of course, to our great guests, Labhaoise Magee and Crissy O'Donovan, for helping us out with their insights into Northern Ireland theatre and a great conversation. Part two of Irish Stew Live is already in your queue, featuring plasterer turned actor, Newry's own Kieran Byrne, and boxer turned actor, the Derry destroyer, John Duddy. So come on back for the next installment of the Global Irish Nation Conversation here on Irish Stew.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.